Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our regular 12:30 AA meeting here at the Pines. My name is Jim, and I am an alcoholic. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm happy to see so many of you here today. Today starts a new format for this group. We finished up with the steps, and today we're going to start our consideration of the Big Book. So I'm hopeful that if you don't have your book with you today, that by next week, if you come to this meeting, you bring your big book. If you don't have one, steal one or borrow one or something, but get a book so that we can all be on the same page together. This is an AA meeting. It's an hour and a half in length, and we take a 10-minute break at the halfway point. My sobriety date is December 20th, 1964. I've been sober through the grace of God since that time, and I'm extremely grateful for that. Let's open the meeting with a moment of silent meditation, and we'll say the Serenity Prayer together. Thank you. Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. And Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other, and may solve their common problem and help others recover from alcoholism. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. And there are no dues or fees for AA membership. We are self-supporting to our own contributions. And AA is not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution. Does not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober, help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. And do we have anyone here today who's been out improving their resume and just coming back? Like to give us your first name? Anyone at their first AA meeting like to give us your first name? Anyone visiting with us from out of town or other groups or out of state or outer space? There we go.
Lisa, I'm an alcoholic.
Where are you from, Lisa?
East Boca.
East what? East Boca. All right. Well, she came clear across town. That's good. Anyone else visiting? Okay. Customary and traditionalist group to read a portion of Chapter 5 from the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. We find it on page 58. And who would like to do the reading today? Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Harvey, an alcoholic and addict.
Harvey.
How it works. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program, usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. There are such unfortunates. They are not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. They are naturally incapable of grasping and developing a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. Their chances are less than average. There are those, too, who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. Our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened, and what we are like now. If you have decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it, then you are ready to take certain steps. At some of these we balked. We thought we could find an easier, softer way, but we could not. With all the ordinances at our command, we beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go absolutely. Remember that we deal with alcohol. Cunning, baffling, powerful. Without help, it is too much for us. But there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find him now. Half measures availed us nothing. We stood at the turning point. We asked his protection and care with complete abandon. Here are the steps we took which are suggested as a program of recovery. 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3. made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. 4. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5. Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7. Humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. 8. Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9. Made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10. Continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Many of us exclaimed, "What an order! I can't go through with it." Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. We are not saints. The point is that we are willing to go along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. Our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent points. Ideas. A. That we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B. That probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. C. That God could and would if He saw.
Good, thank you, Harvey. Before we turn away from page 60, I'd like to point out something. The next 2 words on page 60 after the 3 pertinent ideas are being convinced. It's not a bad idea for us to ask ourselves when we hear this being read or read it, is it true that I am convinced that half measures will avail me nothing, that I stand at a turning point, that the results would be nil until I let go absolutely? Am I convinced that I want what these folks have and I'm willing to go to any lengths to get it? And am I therefore ready to work the steps? Am I convinced that there is one who has all power? That one is God. Am I convinced that I need to find Him now? Am I convinced that I am a victim of the disease of alcoholism and that no human power is going to relieve me of this disease? And am I convinced that God can and will do so if I seek Him? Now, these are legitimate questions for us to ask ourselves every time we see chapter 5 or hear it being read, because those 2 words, being convinced, are utterly essential for us to go forward. They are the prerequisite to doing a 3rd step. And it's a wonderful thing to remind ourselves, because this reading of chapter 5 is not by accident. We see in front of us in these 3 pages a whole program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And one of the things that's important to recognize when we see or read these pages is that there are no weasel words there. There's no equivocation. What we have are declaratory statements, categorical imperatives. They state the facts, whether we like them or not. And they militate against all of those other schemes of recovery and against all those folks out there who would have us water down what it is that was brought to us. Let's turn to page 95 for a second, please. We need to ask ourselves, why this big book? What's the purpose of it? Why was it written in the first place? Let's take a look at the 3rd paragraph on page 95. This deals with the working with a new person. This is at the first meeting with the new person. If he is sincerely interested and wants to see you again, ask him to read this book in the interval. Not part of the book. Not some Reader's Digest version of the book, but the book. And we need to ask ourselves, why is that? Let's turn over to page 96. Second paragraph. Suppose you are making your second visit to a man. He has read this volume and says he's prepared to go through with the 12 steps of the program of recovery. Well, now, how did that new person get to that conclusion? Among other reasons he or she could get that conclusion is because in reading the whole book, that person found stories in the back of the book with which he or she identified, which helped to break down the denial which they walked in the door with. But more than that, reading about somebody who's a real-life person, not some made-up allegory. These are people who are reporting what happened to them, reading about them, identifying with them as alcoholics, and then being told unequivocally, I have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, and here's how I did it. This brings the new person hope, which wasn't there before. Otherwise, we take the last 2/3 of this book and discard them, saying these are just kind of nice things to put yourself to sleep with at night, or to be disregarded entirely as having no real relevance to recovery. Balderdash. There's tremendous relevance, and they're here for a purpose. And when we talk about the big book, we need to talk about the big book in its entirety. Let's take a look at page 45 now. We want to know why this book was written. What's the purpose? The second paragraph on page 45 tells us the truth, that lack of power, that's our dilemma. We always thought, when we came in here, we thought it was the way that our lives had become unbearable. We thought that our problem was that we drank too much. We had blamed everything and everybody, including in many cases God, for our dilemma. And yet, here the big book is saying just the opposite, is lack of power within us, which is the dilemma. And then it goes on to tell us the truth, that we have to find a power by which we can live, and that's as opposed to die. And it had to be a power greater than ourselves. Well, where and how are we to find this power? That's the question. Answered in the next paragraph. Well, that's exactly what this book is all about. Its main purpose is to enable you and me to find a power greater than ourselves which will solve our problem. 2 sentences later, this means we're going to talk about God. There's no equivocation here. This book was written for a very specific purpose. To go out to those in the hinterlands, those people in Cucamonga, California, St. Pierre, North Dakota, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and every point in between, even in Palm Beach and Boca Raton, who didn't have any alcoholics around, who could not reach the people in New York, Akron, or Cleveland, who had no way of receiving this message which these people had been given, and they realized that they were not capable of spreading this message in very quickly. Had to be one-on-one. So they decided to write a book. And they figured that this book, in and of itself, would be sufficient if it were to be distributed out into the whole of the United States, and they figured it would also go to Canada and perhaps into the United Kingdom. And that this book would be enough to get true chronic alcoholics to begin to take a program of recovery, which would include, they knew, would have to include, spreading the word, taking what they learned and taking it to other alcoholics. And that this way, the program that they had been given would be spread, and in a way could never happen otherwise. And so they decided to write a book recognizing by the time they got around to this, after some had been sober a little more than 3 years, that alcoholism was essentially a disease of denial and a disease of rebellion and defiance and of spiritual bankruptcy and a disease of the mind with an anomaly of the body, but that for purposes of reaching out, it was going to be first necessary to write something which would help that poor struggling person out there who is doomed to die of alcoholism, in reading this book, to break down the denial, the mind that tells them that they are not alcoholics, that they don't have a problem. You see, alcoholism is the only deadly incurable disease that I know of which denies its own existence. It's utterly essential, first, that the wall of denial be broken down, because without that there can be no recovery. So this book was written first and foremost to provide the means by which the poor suffering alcoholic out there could pick this book up and say, yes, that's me. Yes, I understand that. They're just like me. They're talking about me. And they're saying that they're alcoholics. Maybe I better think about that. Maybe I am too. Maybe I need this. And the further they went into this book, the more they identified. They wanted to establish credibility. They wanted people to pick up this book and be able to read it and to believe it. And to believe that what they were hearing was the truth. And they accomplished that. Dr. Silkworth, in his letter, which accompanied or preceded his opinion, let's take a look at that. It's on page Roman 12. XXII. Oh, I'm in XII, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm off base here, guys. We're going to find it. Here we go. All right. Look at it's XXVI 26 or 24 if you have the third edition. Look at the top of the page. This is the letter that Dr. Silkworth wrote. That last little paragraph of 2 lines. He wrote, "You may rely absolutely on anything they say about themselves." See how critical that is?
Is it 12?
Yeah, it's either 26 or 24. XXVI or XXIV. Everybody find that? 4 lines down from the top of the page. And so they accomplished what they set out to accomplish. Dr. Silkworth knew that what they wrote about and the things that they wrote and the instructions, directions they gave were true. He'd been watching this process in his own hospital for over 3 years by that time. He knew that what they were talking about here was true, that this is exactly what these people had been doing. And he knew that it wasn't some kind of a philosophy or some invention they'd come up with. It wasn't a treatise to enable some of them to get their PhDs. This was their real life experience. This is what in fact happened to them. And that was what they set out to accomplish. Make it so that the struggling alcoholic out there, without anything else, just this book, will be able to pick this book up and say, yes, I'm one of them too. I find myself here, but beyond that, if they recovered, maybe I can too. To break down the walls of denial and to bring hope. That's why it's so essential that when someone is new and walks in that door, that as soon as we have had a chance to meet with them and share our story with them and tell them a little bit about the disease and about how we recovered, And if they still are interested in what we're doing here, to give them a copy of the book and ask them to read the book. So important. And obviously today this isn't done very much, but I hope that it will come through to us loud and clear how very important that is. Well, now these guys set about the idea of writing a book, and they were grandiose fellows, you know. They were a bunch of egoists and prideful people, and most of them been very successful before they became hopeless, helpless drunks. And a lot of them had education, and they were pretty arrogant about a lot of stuff. And one of the things they had concluded was what they had was of universal application and ought to be spread to the entire world. They could visualize a whole revolution in spiritual pursuits throughout the entire world. Of course, they were right. They just didn't know quite how to go about it. But they knew, or they thought they knew, that what they had was of enormous importance to the whole human race. It turns out that they were right. But in order for them to accomplish this grandiosity in their scheming, they decided to write a book. And they figured that it would be so universally accepted, and especially it would be translated and it would be sold all over, and there was going to be a whole bunch of money made with this book. So not all of this book was written for the purpose of giving. They were not entirely eleemosynary in their methodology here. This was not a charitable venture at first. They formed a separate corporation, and they bought stock in the corporation, and all these stockholders were going to be very wealthy from selling these wonderful books. Well, the exact opposite happened. First of all, they asked Bill Wilson to write this, and they set up an editorial committee to monitor what he did and to correct and edit and so forth. And Bill sat down and he wrote the big book on a typewriter and published it as a lithograph, or not a lithograph, but like a mimeograph, just typed, and it was the first draft of this book, and it was actually put together and sold. It was sold for $3.50, and whoever bought this first draft for $3.50 was promised that they could have a hardcover when the book was published. Marty Mann, the first woman in AA, was one of those who purchased the first draft for $3.50. Think about that. That was, 66 years ago? Or 63 years ago? And the price of the big book today is what, $5.50? Amazing, huh? That first draft was Bill's, carried all of his own prejudices. For example, Bill had it in mind that what was going to happen to us if we were to have recovery was that we would have a spiritual experience. You remember that he had his epiphany, his great spiritual experience. He reports on that in several places, especially in his story. He felt that for the ordinary person who wasn't granted this great spiritual epiphany, they would have to work for it and get a whole series of spiritual experiences under their belt. And that's what he wrote about in chapter 2 when he talks about the solution. He talks about spiritual experiences being the solution. Well, when the editorial board got hold of this, they said, no. That word experience here is too limiting. So we'll change that to spiritual awakening. And so the 12th step was changed to spiritual awakening. Also, Bill was a man who was all pumped up with himself. It was very difficult for him to stay humble. His humility came and went. And when it went, he got himself in lots of trouble. And his lack of humility showed up in the first draft of the big book, because there he wrote, you got to do this, and you got to do that. And all the way through it was instructions to you, to us. And when the editorial committee got hold of it, they said, no, Bill, that's not what we did here. What we did here is we asked you to write a compendium of the experiences of all of us. How did we get sober? So they changed all of that, and they changed it to we. This is what we did. They don't mean what we did together, because quite obviously not everybody sat down and did their four-step together. But what we, each of us individually did, this is what this book contains. They said, Bill, that's what you've written here. You've written a synopsis, a digest of the experiences of each of us, put together into something which is usable and readable. Now, not everybody did exactly what you wrote, but if you put it all together, that's the way it comes out. And he said, that's the way this book is supposed to read. So they changed it all to we did this and we did that. And many other things were changed. Some of the chapters were left almost entirely alone. Chapter 8, Chapter 9. Chapter 8 wasn't changed because that was Bill's answer to the women. And Lois wouldn't write it, so he did. And it's the only lie in the big book, by the way. It's Bill Wilson writing, Bill Wilson and Drag writing as a wife. Other than that, I haven't been able to find a lie in that book. They didn't change that, and they didn't change the 9th chapter or the 10th chapter. They didn't change the 11th chapter. There were a couple of typos and stuff changed, but you see, the basic idea was this. The editorial board said, we want this book to reflect the experiences of each of us in recovery, so that when people pick this book up and read it, they will understand that they are not reading somebody's opinion or somebody's made-up thesis or philosophical or religious point of view, but they're reading the real-life experiences of those who have already lived it. And that turned out to be inspired genius, because when you read the big book that way, what is there to disbelieve? What is there to argue with? You may say, well, you could have done it better, but you can't say you didn't do it. And it's not possible to say you didn't recover, because you don't know that. There were, of course, some people who had relapses. But by and large, the people who worked these steps and continue to work them for the rest of their lives stayed sober the rest of their lives. And so that big book then was sitting, and they got it finally over to the printer, and they managed to get enough money together to get it printed. They got 4,000 copies printed. And it was sitting in this warehouse getting dust. And the only copies that were distributed were copies distributed to the original stockholders and to the people who had bought the first monograph, the first version of the big book, for $3.50. Then they had been counting, you see, on the fact that the Reader's Digest had promised them, the publisher had promised them, that they would do a full article on this big book when it was finally published. And when they got it, and they sent it to the editor and the publisher, and the Reader's Digest turned it down. Said, this is a family magazine. You're a little too rough here. We can't do anything with this. So it was turned down. And now they were really stuck. They didn't know what to do. Shortly thereafter, the Cleveland Plain Dealer newspaper in Cleveland, Ohio, printed 7 articles in succession for a week about AA, and they were pretty good articles, and they had done some research to find out what AA was really doing. And those articles pulled in over 300 new people. Not all of them stuck, of course, but all of a sudden they began to recognize just how powerful it was to have this word get out. Then Liberty Magazine published an article, and that jogged some interest, and then came the big one. Saturday Evening Post, Jack Anderson Jack Alexander, wrote an article, beautifully researched. If you read that article, you'll say, yeah, this guy was right. He saw what was going on. This was all the way back in 1939, when they only had 100 members. That article is reprinted, by the way, as a pamphlet and available through General Service. A lot of groups have those. You can get hold of that. You'd be amazed what he wrote. That Saturday Evening Post was a magazine that everybody read. Our article was under the cover of a Norman Rockwell cover. And everybody got the Saturday Evening Post, and everybody read it. And all of a sudden, boom! From all over the country, from all over the English-speaking world came inquiries. It hit a huge nerve. All those people out there suffering from this, and the families of those people, and the friends of those people read this thing and said, wow, these guys actually have a way of getting a drunk to reform. That's what they called it then, getting reformed. As if somehow or another we're a bunch of crooks, and now they're going to reform us. And the inquiry started piling in, and they had to establish an office in New York, and they sold those 4,000 copies out, and did another printing, another printing. I think there were 17 or 18 or more printings of the first edition. If you have a first edition big book, it's real thick because they had cheap paper they used then. That's worth around $10,000 today, because there were only 4,000 of them, and not too many of them still exist in any kind of decent shape. But that's the way it got kicked off. And the story is a story of a whole bunch of faith, a certain amount of profit motive, but mostly and almost entirely inspiration. Now, when Bill Wilson was asked, how did AA come about? He said, nobody invented AA. It just grew through the grace of God. Well, he knew. He knew that he, as one single human being, was not capable of doing what's here. If you take this book and take the first 164 pages, you will find the most dense writing you'll ever try to read in your life. Many sentences have 2 and 3 ideas in them. If you took those 164 pages, you could very easily expand them to 10 volumes. And yet it's all there. That's why, as we go through the book together, we're going to examine this book word for word, phrase by phrase, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. And not only are we going to search for what the meaning is all the way through and how it all ties together, but we're going to be looking at this book as a unitary whole. Because you see what happens when somebody is writing from inspiration. It's not organized very well. We're going to find stuff scattered all the way through the book that seems to be out of place. I'll give you a couple of examples. If you look on page 63, let's do that right now. I want to show you one of the glaring examples of this. And we have to be careful because we can so easily be misled if we're not being careful. Right at the top of page 63, the reference here is to the decision we make to quit playing God and to let God from here on be the father and we the child. He be the director. He be the principal, we the agent. And so when it says when we sincerely took such a position, that is, when we in fact came to a place of surrender, when we implemented the decision of the third step, which means we have worked the other steps, which means we have reached the 12th step, which means we've had a spiritual awakening, which means we've entered the world of the Spirit and have become God conscious and have been restored to sanity and developed a sixth sense. All these things. When we sincerely took such a position, all sorts of remarkable things followed. We have to be careful here because this paragraph refers to what's going to happen later. It's not saying that the moment that I make a decision of the third step that all of these things are going to happen. It doesn't mean that at all. It means once I have implemented that. And what follows is precisely the promises which we find after the ninth step, different language but the same promises. So this paragraph speaks prospectively, but it has one nugget in it which is essentially pointed right now at someone who is at the third step. Here's what it is. We had a new employer. Being all-powerful, he provided what we needed if we kept close to him and performed his work well. Think about that. That's the whole program of Alcoholics Anonymous. God will give us everything we need, including sobriety, if we do two things: if we stay close to him and if we perform his work well. Staying close to God is 10 and 11. Performing his work well is 12. This means that first we're going to have to get close. Then we must stay close. And when we stay close and perform his work well, God gives us everything we need. And so we can see here in this paragraph that it appears to be out of place. And yet, there's a very specific reason it's here. Because it's telling us, looky here, you're at the third step. You've made a decision to allow God to become the father and you the child. You've made a decision that hereafter, in this drama of life, God is to be your director. And that you've made a decision to turn your life and your will over to his care. That's fine. But you must now implement that decision. The third sentence of the third step prayer makes that clear. We're asking God in the prayer to take away our difficulties. And we don't know what they are yet because we haven't done our inventory. But we recognize that we are still blocked off from God. So we're asking him to take away our difficulties so that victory over them may bear witness to those we would help of God's power, love, and way of life working in and through us. So we could be an example of recovery to other people. Recognizing that right now we're not at that point, but we've got work we must do. Therefore, the third step turns out to be not only a prayer of offering ourselves to God, but also a commitment on our part to go through with the rest of the steps. Which means that somewhere down the line, especially by the time we reach the ninth step, all these promises in this paragraph will have come true. Automatically. They are the inevitable result of our doing the work. So we can see from this then that when we look at this book and when we study it together, we need to be able to identify where everything is and how it all ties together. It's a fine mosaic. It's a beautiful mosaic. And like any mosaic, if you take 2 or 3 of the tiles out, it doesn't work. All the tiles have to be there. And our purpose in doing this is to see what all these tiles are and how they all fit together. Please open your books up to Romans 13, XIII. This foreword to the first edition was written after the editorial board had gotten through with their changes in the big book and when it was getting ready to be sent to the printer. And it reflects, therefore, the collective thinking of the 100, especially as it was condensed into approximately 26 people who had responsibility for the editing of the big book. The last of those 26 was a fellow named Clarence Snyder. Some of you have been around a long time. You may remember Clarence. He lived here in Florida. And there are quite a few of his tapes out floating around. And he reported quite a bit of what transpired in this editorial committee. Apparently it was a Donnybrook. They really had some knockdown, drag-out fights because there was such a wide divergence of opinion and emphasis among the conservatives and the liberals and the people who were very, very interested in making this as much a religion as possible, and those who were determined that it not have any emphasis or taint of religion whatsoever. Nevertheless, they finally got it all together. And then this foreword was written. Now let's see what this has to say on page 13. We, the great ubiquitous we. Very important to remember that when we talk about AA as being a we program, by that is meant that we, each of us, individually did these things. We all did these things, is what it means. We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. At the time this was written, as far as I know, there was only one woman in AA, that was Marty Mann, but many more followed, of course. Notice that the name Alcoholics Anonymous is already being applied to the fellowship. It was originally the name of the book. They took the name of the fellowship from the name of the book. And the name of the book was a compromise. There had been 4 or 5 other names that were considered to be more appropriate, but it turned out that those were titles of many other books, and so they didn't use them. They settled on Alcoholics Anonymous, and then that became the name of the fellowship. It was first the name of the book. Are more than 100 men and women who have recovered. Now we have to be real careful with this recovery thing, because it's not a question of cure. Remember on page 85 it tells us that we are not cured of alcoholism. That what we really have is a daily reprieve which is contingent upon the maintenance of our spiritual condition. So what is it they mean by recovered? In this context it means full remission. Full remission from the symptoms of the disease of alcoholism. The disease is still there, but we no longer suffer from the symptoms. We have had full remission. From what? From a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Now notice that in this first sentence they're recognizing the full scope of the disease. That it is a disease not only of the mind and the spirit, but of the body. And this condition, by the time we reached the door of AA, had become in our minds hopeless. We tried everything else and nothing worked. When we look at this then, we're looking at the idea of putting into full and complete and lifetime remission a deadly, incurable, progressive illness. That it no longer will be killing us and ruling our lives and ruining our lives, but that the full ravages of this disease will be in remission and we can stay there for the rest of our lives. Therefore, what it really amounts to is that we carry the seed of alcoholism, but not the fruit. And so, when we think about a bottom, they've described it for us here. A seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Now the word hopeless there is really important, you see, because remember we talked about this book and what it was designed to do. It was designed to bring hope to the hopeless. And that's what it does. Because a person who has no hope is a person who is very unlikely to accept any remedy, any solution. So we must first bring them hope. Now, this next sentence sets the stage for the whole big book, and we need to keep this in mind, not only for ourselves, but for the people to whom we carry the message. And when we're sitting in meetings and listening to and sharing, we got to remember what this book is about. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. What does the word show mean? It means that we're going to reveal to you in terms of a set of directions precisely how we recovered. Let's break that down. This does not amount to any kind of a theory. It is not some kind of a made-up allegory. This is not some opinion. This is not some philosophy. This is not some religious concept. This is real life experience of those who have recovered at the time of the writing of this book from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And what they're saying to us is very simple. This is what worked for us. And we believe sincerely that if you will do what we did, it will likewise work for you. That's the message here. Therefore, what we have done is to show you in this book precisely how we have recovered. We have included within this book a precise set of directions which are the roadmap to recovery, which we took, and we are now giving it to you, hopefully to follow. Over and over again, the big book gives us the same message. Follow these directions. Utilize these spiritual tools. Do a few simple things, it says. And so we must not confuse this big book and the directions in it as if they were some kind of a leaf just floated out here to see if it keeps floating. We're not running this up the flagpole to see who salutes it. This is not an advertising gimmick. This is the real life experiences of those who came before and who helped write this book. When we take it that way, then we see the context within which we must read the book and utilize it, how we put it to work for us. Remember, I suggested to you that after the reading of chapter 5, take those last two words in the next paragraph, first two words in the next paragraph, being convinced. Are we in fact convinced? Am I convinced that I want what these folks have and I'm willing to go to any lengths to get it? And that therefore I'm ready to work the steps, to take the steps. And when we look at from that standpoint, it makes it easy to take all the other literature and put it over here where it belongs, as auxiliary to the big book. Auxiliary only. Only in here do we find the answers. Only in here do we find the directions. Remember on page 85 again, it tells us that if we have carefully followed directions, we have commenced to sense the flow of God's Spirit into us, and we've become God conscious. We must not confuse the idea of suggestions as if this was the way of softening this message in some way or equivocating this message in some way, because those who do not want to follow the directions will always say, oh, but they're only suggestions. The suggestion is that you do it. We suggest you do this if you want to recover. We don't have anything else to suggest to you because this is what we did. We don't know anything else. These 12 steps are the program of recovery, and here, if you want to recover, we suggest you do them. Pull the ripcord. Take your scuba gear with you before you dive to 100 feet. Whatever it is, follow that suggestion. You see, this way we avoid the trap of the easier, softer way. We avoid the trap of New Age AA, which is intent upon infusing this fellowship with human solutions, because the human solutions don't require of us that we be honest with ourselves or that we seek and find a power greater than ourselves, and they don't require of us that we make a full surrender. They require of us that we get in touch with our feelings, or that we come into every meeting and bitch our heads off. And everything that I don't rat myself out on is going to eat me alive. So you got to sit here and listen to me. Because when I don't open my mouth, I'm going to open the bottle. And the other side of the coin, which ignores the directions entirely, says just don't drink and go to meetings. That's wonderful for those who can stop or moderate on their own, given sufficient purpose for doing so. There are plenty of those folks with us, and that's fine. They don't need the steps. They don't need the big book. They don't need God. They just need to have enough fear of their next drunk to stop drinking, and they can do that. If you're a chronic alcoholic, you cannot. And when you take a first step and you admit that you are powerless over alcohol, it means precisely what it says. You can't stop drinking on your own. Period. And for anybody to tell you that's what you're to do, they might just as well be pushing you in front of a bus. That's what these people are saying to us. Looky here. We were afflicted with the disease of alcoholism. We came from a place where we were seemingly hopeless in both mind and body. We were nuts, we were screwy, we were insane. Our bodies could not tolerate alcohol, and every time we put a drop into us, it wanted more. And our minds kept telling us it was okay to drink, and we could get away with it this time, and we had these strange mental blank spots in our minds. But we're saying to you, we recovered from all of this, and here's how we did it. Now, millions and millions of people have followed these directions and have recovered, just as the first 100. Why do we ignore that? Why is it that we fight so hard to find some alternative way to recover? I don't know. Maybe it's a continuation of our death wish, maybe. I'm not sure. Going on, it says this. For them, and this is talking about other alcoholics, for them, we hope these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. What they're saying is, we hope that when you, as a new person, pick up this book and you read this book, you will identify yourself with these people. You will say, yes, I am one of them. And yes, I believe what they're saying. We don't have to publish our resumes here, or we don't have to have any kind of backup or authentication from learned people. What we give you is this book, and we want you to pick this up and read it and say, aha, yes, this is me. And when Dr. Silkworth said, remember, you can believe anything these people say about themselves. How important that is now. Because when this book is the sole and only means of recovery for the people out there who have no AA. And it's hard for us to recognize that, because when we walk in the door now, here's AA, full blown. A room full of people. A complete system going on here, with people who have been here 3 days and people who have been here 30 years. And all this stuff, and there are people who are GSRs, and there are people who are secretaries and treasurers, and got a beautiful room to meet in, and a club, and they go to New York, and they go to conventions, and all. It's full blown. We walk in brand new. We might just as well think this thing's been here forever. No. 66 years. I've been alive a lot longer in AA. A miracle. And millions of people using these directions and following the footsteps of the first 100 have recovered. Why would we even think about ignoring that as the single sole precedent that we have, the only thing we need to know about what we should do to recover? Pick up this book, follow the directions, and recover. We think this account of our experiences will help everyone to better understand the alcoholic. That's a very important statement. Think what they're saying. These guys believed, and they were right, that the people out there didn't have the faintest clue about us. We were people who were to be consigned to prisons or institutions or hidden out in the back room or simply tolerated stumbling around the streets, made the laughing stock and the joke, and people made their living imitating drunks. The town drunk had the same place with the village idiot. We were immoral. What we did was criminal. At the very least, it was lack of will and lack of stature, lack of any kind of moral fiber. We were bad people. We were people to be shunned. And the consensus opinion, which was the truth, was that there was no hope for us. Nobody could get a drunk sober. The churches, God bless them, tried every way they knew, and it didn't work. The psychiatrists tried every way they knew, it didn't work. The judges and jailers and cops tried every way they knew, and it didn't work. They filled us full of laudanum, they filled us full of poisons, they did all kinds of stuff to try to get us to stop drinking, and none of it ever worked. So the consensus opinion was that we're really bad people who were unreformed drunks. And if we stopped drinking, they would say we were reformed. Because they didn't know that you and I suffer from a deadly, incurable, progressive disease. And these guys are saying, let's get the word out so that people will understand what they're dealing with here when they're dealing with a drunk. This is not a bad person. This is a person who may have wonderful opportunities, wonderful intelligence, great willpower, able to handle almost anything else in their lives, but not the alcohol. They don't belong in institutions and jails. They belong in recovery, because there is recovery for these people. And so they thought, this book, if it gets out there, maybe everyone else will be better able to understand the alcoholic. And of course today that's come true. Not that everyone does, but certainly the vast majority of people now have a totally different view of the alcoholic. Obviously, if you live with an alcoholic, you may be on a constant state of uproar, and it's hard to keep in mind that they're a sick person, because we're so damnably obnoxious and rotten, mean, stinking people when we're drunk. And those who have to suffer with us have a hard time being charitable about it. But the fact is that we, regardless of what we do, are sick. Going on and explaining this a little bit more, many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person. So you can see another double-barreled purpose of this big book was to go out there as a missionary to the world, so that everybody out there would begin to more fully understand what we're going through and what it's going to require for us to recover. Look at the chapter to wives. Look at the chapter family afterward. Look at the chapter to employers. Specifically written for that purpose, weren't they? So now we begin to see that there's a much broader scope to this book than we ever really stopped to consider. And finally, and besides, we are sure that our way of living has its advantages for all. Of course. Of course. Look at page 116, please. By the way, what we're going to read here is the precursor of the Al-Anon family groups. You may not know, but there was a group in the 1940s, an offshoot of the Washingtonians called the Martha Washingtons. And they were the first group of women who were the wives and friends of alcoholics. And while their husbands were in recovery in the Washingtonians, the Martha Washingtons formed a support group of their own, utilizing much of the love and tolerance which the Washingtonians were using for recovery. Now let's see why it is that everybody else is going to be affected by what we have here if they wish to accept it. Second full paragraph. We have elsewhere remarked, this is on 116 now, how much better life is when lived on a spiritual plane. Well, amen to that. And all of us who have worked steps know that to be true. If God can solve the age-old riddle of alcoholism, He can solve your problems too. We wise found that, like everybody else. Now, that phrase, 3 words, means the whole world. Everybody else. The whole world. The French say tout le monde. Everybody. Like everybody else, we were afflicted with pride, self-pity, vanity, and all the things which go to make up the self-centered person. And we were not above selfishness or dishonesty. As our husbands began to apply spiritual principles in their lives, we began to see the desirability of doing so too. And they did. Now, of course, they had a major advantage, because this club and the groups that meet here are wonderful. I see almost no closed meetings. Meetings here are open. Wonderful. The meetings, when they first got started, the whole family was there. They met for hours in people's homes. And the wives participated, and they were directly participating in their husband's recovery. So when they write this, when Bill writes this for them, this is not just eyewash, this is the truth. This is what they found. I know from my own experience, all 3 of my kids were AA brats, and because their mother was gone. And when they were around AA enough, they got it. They got it. And as Alateens, they worked the steps, and both of my daughters are 9th degree black belts in Al-Anon now. I pity their poor husbands. But the program reached out and grabbed them just like it grabbed me. Notice that what they're saying here is that the people out there have all the same defects of character we have. They just don't drink over them. And so, going back on page 13 again, you see now the significance of this sentence. And besides, we are sure that our way of living has its advantages for all. What is our way of living? Turn to page 83. You laugh. Okay, well, this is just the tip of the iceberg, guys. It's the way we're going to be reading this book, so get used to it. Page 83, second full paragraph, first line. The spiritual life is not a theory. We have to live it. That's our way of living. The 12th step, practice these principles in all of our affairs. This is our way of living, and these guys who wrote this were convinced that this way of living was applicable to all human beings. Think about it. AA is now in 140 some different countries. The big book has been translated into 30 different languages. There are over 5 million of us, and 63 years ago there were 100. Whew! And there are 12-step groups out there that covering every single possible thing you can think of which afflicts a human being. I'm sure they have nail biters anonymous. There must be a nose pickers anonymous. Probably a lint pickers anonymous. If you're not in a 12-step group, you're off the A list. You don't get invited to parties anymore. You haven't got anything to talk about. What a revolution. 12 steps, by the way, if we haven't recognized it as of yet, I believe, are changing the world. I think the 12 steps to the last great hope of this world. And these were men of vision. See what their vision was, how clearly they saw just from these 100 people. They saw clearly what was going to happen. And they had no idea how fast it would happen. You see, the growth of AA and all these 12-step groups is geometric progression, not arithmetic. It just goes like this. First edition, they circulated 300,000 copies. Second edition, 1,100,000 copies. Third edition, 12 million copies. You know that they're even translating the Big Book into Mayan now? Because in Central America, Maya is a pretty large language. Mayan. I was in the first group of AAs ever to be allowed to Russia. And this was before AA was permitted there. But they allowed us to come in, and we met with people who were in recovery using the Big Book written in French and Big Book written in German. And we saw alcoholism as an absolute epidemic in Russia. Today, of course, the Big Book is translated into Russian, and there are hundreds, maybe now thousands of groups. I helped to establish 6 different AA in 6 different cities in Colombia, South America. And I watched how fast it worked, just like that. As soon as people had the idea that here was recovery, they came flocking to it. And so we're not dealing with some little puny thing that just exists in southwest Palm Beach County. This is everywhere, and it's powerful. And the reason it is so powerful is because we speak the truth, and the truth is the truth that God gave us by way of inspiration. We're not dealing here with a bunch of ideas and philosophy. We're dealing with spiritual principles which have been around forever. As far back as we can go in all the writings, we'll find these same principles stated, but not as steps of action. They're stated as things we ought to be. The 12 steps are the first place ever that I know of where these same spiritual principles were restated as steps of action. God finally woke up to the fact that He was telling us what to be and we didn't know how. So now He showed us how to be. And that's what we do. And when we work these 12 steps, we incorporate these spiritual principles into our lives. They become the way we live. The spiritual life is not a theory. We have to live it. Just think what this world would be like if everybody did that. Someday, maybe. But we are at the cutting edge of a great revolution in spiritual thinking, spiritual living, spiritual thought. It's a wonderful place to be. Let's go back on page 13 now. Second paragraph, page XIII. It is important that we remain anonymous. Oh, they're going to tell us here that they're afraid that somebody might find out that they're a drunk? No. We remain anonymous because we're too few at present to handle the overwhelming number of personal appeals which may result from this publication. This was kind of a snotty way of putting it, wasn't it? You see, they weren't following their own advice, were they? They weren't letting God lead them. They weren't letting God have His way, and they were foreclosing and closing the doors so that they couldn't be available to those who needed help. Shame on them for doing that. But you see, the question of anonymity had nothing to do with the fear of being found out. It doesn't today either. Anonymity has nothing to do with the fear of being found out. Anonymity is a spiritual principle which is based upon self-sacrifice and humility. We don't use our last names in order that we preserve ourselves from all the temptations of power driving and from notoriety and from becoming heroes and becoming all the things that human beings want to be. We sacrifice our human needs and wants and desires to have this sort of recognition. for the good of the whole and for our own good, because it allows us to stay humble when otherwise we very well might not. And self-sacrifice is the name of the game, and Bill's story clearly stated that work and self-sacrifice for others is the only way that we stay sober. And so anonymity, and when you read the 12th tradition, you'll find that anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, because it represents humility and self-sacrifice, not fear. Going on, being mostly business or professional folk, we could not well carry on our occupations in such an event. Well, whoop-de-doo. Poor guys. They were literally hiding out. And yet, by hiding out, they created a tradition. And so I have to think that somewhere along the line, God put this idea in their heads. Be anonymous. Go back and look at the Washingtonians. See what happened with them. They failed after 6 years because one of the main reasons because they didn't stay anonymous. They got out there and played up their membership. They went from church to church to church, evangelizing, using their full names. And once in a while, one of these big shots would get drunk, and everybody began to lose any kind of credibility with them, or belief in what they were doing, and they failed. And so we stay anonymous. That doesn't mean anonymous in here. Unfortunately, I've been around here a long time, and I've been carrying meetings here for quite a while. I know a lot of first names. I only know one person in this room by his last name, and none of you know, or most of you don't know my last name. Now you got to ask yourself, why do we do this? What's the point? It's just a habit, it's something that we do. And when somebody gets up here and says, my name is Jim Bramble and I'm an alcoholic, which is my name, everybody says, oh, well, geez, where's his humility? What is he trying to prove? So I just don't do it. I hate to get into conflicts with anybody. My name is Jim. Okay, now, we would like it understood that our alcoholic work is an avocation. The word avocation means hobby. Now, if you go back and look at what they wrote, and put down the fact that their work in AA is a hobby, it's a shame on them. Anyway, that's what they wrote. So we read it and we try to understand it. But the beautiful part about it is that out of all this came the tradition of anonymity. So really, I guess it doesn't matter what was the driving force behind it. What was the motivation? Because that principle of anonymity is of utter importance, and it means that this fellowship continues to have the complete credibility with the rest of the world that it's always had, because we don't ask anything of anybody. We don't blow our own horn. We're not out to make any headlights. We're just here to get alcoholics sober, to help each other with sobriety. And people have come to recognize that this is the way we are, and we've never changed. Holy cow, I don't know where this hour goes. We're going to, I want to just cover this four-line paragraph here on 13, because this is important. When writing or speaking publicly about alcoholism, we urge each of our fellowship to omit his personal name, designating himself instead as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now notice that after they get through with this whole thing about how they're only doing this as a hobby, they came up with the specific tradition, which has been, of course, was later memorialized as part of the 12 traditions, that we, in public, we do not use our last names. Notice also that if you happen to be a little bit queasy about saying, my name is Jim, I'm an alcoholic, maybe you're not quite sure whether that's true or not. But on the other hand, the tradition allows you to be a member so long as you say you are. And so you're at a quandary. Do I just automatically say, my name is Jim, I'm an alcoholic, so I avoid controversy or being criticized? Look at what it tells you here. All you have to do is say, my name is Jim and I am a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And this takes away the whole sting for people who may have other problems but desire to stop drinking and are therefore members here. I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Is all we are required to say, and even that, not in among ourselves, but it's habitual. This is what we do. You have good reference to the fact that when you identify yourself as a member, that's all that's required. Okay? Now next week, when we meet again, we're going to take up where we left off, and in the forward of the first edition, we're going to find 4 or 5 of the traditions as we now know them already had been adopted here by the time the first edition. And we're going to take a look at some of the background of those traditions to see how they fit in, because, see, each time that we read this book, we need to know what we're reading and how it came about and what it refers to. And these traditions got their start right here, so we want to take a look and see where they came from and how critically important they were for the continuation of the fellowship. Without these traditions, we'd have died long ago. We'd have passed away long ago. I want to welcome you to our regular Sunday afternoon. What do we call this group again? The Freedom Group. All right, I won't forget next time. The Freedom Group of Alcoholics Anonymous. My name is Jim. I'm an alcoholic.
Hey, Jim.
Hi, everybody. I'm glad to see everybody here. Happy to be here myself. If you haven't been with us before, this meeting is an hour and a half in length, and we take a 10-minute break at the halfway point. At this juncture, this group is studying the Big Book together, and we estimate we'll probably be doing that for the next year or so, maybe a year and a half. We're going through the book very carefully, studying it as we go, word for word, phrase by phrase, sentence by sentence, to see what is really in this book and to be able to understand it and see how it all ties together. In the process of doing this, we will be considering the steps in great detail as well, because of course you can't read the Big Book without the steps. So I guess you could call it a Big Book step meeting. By the way, if at any time during the reading and the remarks I'm making, you have a question or any comments you'd like to make, please feel free to do so. And we'll try to take some time at the end of the meeting for sharing from the floor. This is an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. We use a kind of an abbreviated format in the interest of saving time. But let's start off with a moment of silent meditation, and we'll say the Serenity Prayer together. Thank you, Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. And this group likes to recite the preamble together. So if that's what we are going to do, let's gather ourselves for a beautiful chorus of the preamble. Ready? Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other, that they may solve their common problem and help others recover from alcoholism. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking, and there are no dues or fees for AA membership. We are self-supporting through our own contributions, and AA is not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution, does not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober and help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. Excellent job. It also is true, and Bill has mentioned in several of his writings, that the primary purpose of an Alcoholics Anonymous group is the teaching and practice of the 12 steps. And of course that's what we do here along with our study of the Big Book. We have anybody who was out there checking to see if it's gotten any better and is now coming back having found it hasn't? Or maybe just improving your resume. Anyone who's coming into AA for their first time today, would like to give us your first name so we could gang up on you after the meeting. Anybody visiting from out of town, other groups or outer space? All right. Today we're going to continue our study of the Big Book. We're going to start on page Roman 15, XV, forward to the second edition. Before we get started with this, I want to remind us of the basic facts of this Big Book. It is so important to remember what it is we're reading here. This book was written by those who had gone before us, the people who had spent anywhere from 6 months to 3 years in recovery. And in doing so, they had followed certain steps, they had followed certain directions, and they had recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And they decided that what they had was so valuable that it needed to be put in a form where it could be disseminated to all alcoholics out there, wherever they might be. And so they wrote a book which in effect details their experience in recovery, what they did to recover from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Never forget that the Big Book is not a compilation of philosophy or opinions. It was not written by some PhD candidate. This is the actual experience of those who helped to write the book. And as such, what they were saying to us, we have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, and we truly believe that if you'll do what we did, you too can recover. That's why we wrote the book. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this volume. And if we keep that in mind, we will be able to put aside much of the malarkey that floats around our rooms, which in effect disparages the Big Book or minimalizes the Big Book, seeking to get us to indulge ourselves in some kind of comparative scheme of things, comparing ourselves with others, for example, or to begin to try to recover through feelings, through group therapy, with the idea that the more we hold in, the more we suffer, that we've got to spill our guts in every meeting. The idea that somehow or another an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting is Problems Anonymous. We ignore the solution and talk about the problems, and therefore somehow magically they will go away. It's simply not true. And those who disparage the Big Book are missing the point. Millions have recovered using this book. Why not you and me? Why would we put aside something that has proven over all these years to work for everybody who's willing to use it? So if we keep that in mind, then as we read the book, we'll stay centered on what it's trying to tell us. On page Roman 15, forward to the second edition, figures given in this forward describe the fellowship as it was in 1955. Now, this is not a whole lot different from the situation when I came in 64. There were a few more people, quite a few more people in the fellowship by that time, less than 200,000 they estimated, and now we're well over 5 million. So you can see what's really happening here. This forward to the second edition was written primarily to give the new person, the person picking up this book for the first time, a kind of a thumbnail sketch of how this fellowship came about, a little bit of the history. and quite a bit about the tradition, so that the new person picking up this book would already have some fair idea of who we are and where we came from. The sad fact, of course, is that not many people read this, a lot of times because their sponsors don't tell them to. They tell them, read the first chapter, second chapter, and third chapter, and then I'll tell you if you're ready to work your first step. This kind of stuff. The Big Book says, read this book. Why? Because every word in it is meant for the new person. Every word in it is meant to help the new person break down the walls of denial and to bring them hope. The seemingly hopeless state of mind and body is only an illusion. The fact of the matter is that no matter how far down the scale any of us have gone, AA holds out the hope of recovery, and it's a very real hope. There's no chimera here. This is not some kind of a put-on. The truth is that no matter how far down we've gone, we can recover, provided we take certain steps and work with certain directions. The Big Book makes that clear too. So this foreword was written to bring the newcomer an idea of the fellowship, to help them get themselves oriented a little bit. But it's excellent. It is not inclusive. It leaves a whole lot of stuff out. But if we want to remind ourselves what we're doing here and where this all came from, it's not a bad idea to pick up these few pages and read them. Let's see what it says, page 15. Since the original foreword to this book was written in 1939, a wholesale miracle has taken place. Our earliest printing voiced the hope that every alcoholic who journeys will find the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous at his destination. Already, continues the early text, 2s and 3s and 5s of us have begun to spring up in other communities. Now, of course, that was happening, and we sometimes forget that. There were people floating in and out of Cleveland, Akron, and New York who were, and people who had been met out in the hinterlands by the members of those groups who met them in business or through friends or acquaintances. And many of these people had been approached and had been given a lot of information about AA. Some of them had come to meetings in one of the 3 formal groups, and then they'd gone out into their home cities and towns and had begun working with others. Nobody knew how many of these people there were. They estimated there were probably thousands by the time they got around to writing this book. But since there was no head count, no census, it was impossible to know just how many people had already been had their lives changed by the Alcoholics Anonymous fellowship as it existed at that time, and the 6 steps that they were using, and the spiritual way of life which they espoused. And so they were out there by 2s and 3s and 4s, and they were beginning to meet together. And yet, remember, they had no basic text to follow. When you and I walked in that door, this place was full-blown. I mean, it was a going concern. And there was literature, and there were pamphlets, and there were people up here leading a meeting, and there were traditions, and there was coffee, and everybody knew everybody else. And we walked in, and we looked around. It was hard to believe that this thing had not always existed. It's kind of like going into a church. Hasn't it always been here? Well, no. Alcoholics Anonymous is quite a bit younger than I am. I have a birthday coming up this month in a few days, so I'm getting a little sensitive about old and all that stuff. Be careful about that. People are always saying, I met this old guy. I remember a few years ago I was doing the steps at Little River Club in Miami, and one of the girls I sponsor had a sponsee who came there and said, well, there's this guy doing the steps at the river. And my sponsee asked her, well, who is it? She said, I don't know, but he's white and he's old and he's tall. And so that was quite a few years ago too. Anyways, that's not exactly the way one wants to be remembered. All right, so we know now that what we're looking at here is a text that was not only designed to go out to people who had no one with whom they were in contact, but also to all these people who are spread around out there, who had nothing except what they remembered of what they had been told, and their experience was beginning to unfold as well. So there was a whole valuable pool of AA recovery out there that was not being reached. Let's go on page 15. 16 years have elapsed between our first printing of this book and the presentation in 1955 of our second edition. In that brief space, Alcoholics Anonymous has mushroomed into nearly 6,000 groups whose membership is far above 150,000 recovered alcoholics. Of course, we know now today the groups number well over 100,000. Some, I don't know the exact number now. New York would know. I think it's around 106, 107,000 groups. And those are only the groups that registered with New York, because there are many, many groups that never bother to do that. Groups that meet in people's homes or just meet and don't bother to let New York to even exist. So there's a lot of that going on. And over 5 million in membership worldwide is the estimate now. Of course, everybody knows it's impossible to get a census of AA. So all of these things are estimates. And groups may form and have 10 members, and there are 50 people who come to their meetings. And some of those people are not formally members of any group. So there's a whole bunch of folks out there in recovery who are not in any way accounted for. In that brief space, groups are to be found in each of the United States and all the provinces of Canada. AA has flourished in communities in the British Isles, the Scandinavian countries, South Africa, South America, Mexico, Alaska, Australia, and Hawaii. All told, promising beginnings have been made in some 50 foreign countries and U.S. possessions. Some are just now taking shape in Asia. Many of our friends encourage us by saying this is but a beginning, only the augury of a much larger future ahead, and how true that turned out to be. Something on the magnitude now of 144 countries with AA formally established therein, and the big book translated into getting now close to 30 foreign languages. Over 5 million people, it may be closer to 10 million people actually in recovery. And this doesn't even count the people who are using the 12 steps for every other known possible problem that human beings can have, including those who are obsessive lint pickers, not to speak of those who abuse their nose from time to time, people who are obsessed with gambling and eating, people are obsessed with each other, people are obsessed with sex, all kinds of different variations of narcotics. And so the beat goes on, and all of these groups in one way or another are using the 12 steps. And this, of course, is not something that was not anticipated by the people who started this outfit, you know. They almost universally agreed that these 12 steps had application to every single human being and to every human problem. They believed that. And I think they were right. In fact, I wrote a monograph called The 12 Steps Are for Everybody, because I believe it. I don't think that any human being can do other than to greatly improve their lives by utilizing the 12 steps and incorporating those steps into everything that they do. Can't help it. Their lives will change dramatically. And so there has been this explosive growth. It's almost geometric in its progression rather than linear. It's just that fast. And why? Sometimes I think we forget to ask ourselves these basic questions. How did this happen? Why is it working this way? Why is this spreading out so fast? Is it some kind of a social thing, a societal thing, or is it a cult thing? No. The truth is that it's spreading like this because it works. Because it works. It's so simple. It works. And those who try to dilute or excuse or to denigrate the 12 steps are way off base. And the history proves it. They work. And if they did not work, my friends, we wouldn't be here. There would be no such thing as AA. It's only because the 12 steps work that we're here. It's only because the 12 steps work that there is this worldwide fellowship. Only. Otherwise, because see, we don't have any other message. A lot of people import messages from other sources and try to foist them off on us, but the only message we really have is the 12 steps. Everything else is peripheral to that, because without the steps we don't exist. With the steps nothing can touch us. With the steps we get to have a life beyond anything we could ever have dreamed of. We get to straighten out our lives. We get to change our lives. We get to become people with a mission and a purpose in life, where before we were drifting. Imagine yourself in your earlier existence, I don't mean past life, standing out here in the ocean with the waves coming in and breaking on the shore, and you're standing out there about 30 feet, and the waves wash you this way, and then the outgoing wave pulls you this way, and you go back and forth, and you're getting more and more tired, and you're not going anywhere except where the waves push you. That's what was happening to us. We hadn't learned how to deal with life in any way. We just simply existed, and we survived, and we sought the most possible pleasure we could find. We didn't have a reason for being there. We were just there. But in here, we got a tremendous reason for being here. God got us here, and He expects us to carry His message. And in doing so, He's promised us that we will get everything we need in life. Not what we want, but what we need. And that promise always comes true. And then it doesn't matter what the vicissitudes of life may be. It doesn't matter that we may get dealt a joker once in a while. Some people do and some people don't. That's the way life is. But that's the way life was going to be whether we had this program or not. You stop and think about it. The fact is that whatever happens in our lives, we've climbed into God's pocket, and we're sitting there nestled in very securely. And we know that we're protected and safe, regardless of what happens. And very few people outside of our fellowship can say that, because they don't know what to do to get in God's pocket. They don't know what action to take. That's the difference. Our 12 steps are the action that we take to surrender and to know God's will and to be faithful to His will and obedient to His will. And that's what puts us in His pocket. Now then, we start on the history of AA, down at the bottom of page 15, XV. The spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck at Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician. Please notice that Bill, in writing this forward, did not proclaim that AA started back in 1934 at the end of the year when he was recovering in Towns Hospital. He places the beginning of the fellowship in June of 1935, and our Founders Day is used to celebrate that event. The talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician, that's Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith. 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience, followed by a meeting with an alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day. He had also been greatly helped by the late William D. Selkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism who is now counted no less than a medical saint by AA members. and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. From this doctor, the broker had learned the grave nature of alcoholism. Though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford groups, he was convinced of the need for moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitutions to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God. Now, when you read that sentence, you see all the basic stuff of this 12 steps, don't you?
Yeah.
And that's because our heritage, our inheritance from the Oxford groups was very strong. If you have a third edition, you will find there the 6 steps on page 292. I don't know where it is in the 4th edition. I'm deficient in my knowledge there, and I'm going to have to find out. I think it's still in there.
Jim, that last sentence that you just read, you know, many people live their lives that way even before AA was created. And I think it's important to add that, you know, what separates us, what makes us strong and what makes it work for us, aside from the sentence that you just read, because people lived their lives this way and they didn't need Alcoholics Anonymous or the existence of it in order to live a peaceful life within themselves and doing God's will. What separates us is the fact that our ability to, our credit, to convince, I can't say the word credibility, to convince another drunk that we know exactly what they're talking about. And I think that takes off, I think that's our fellowship right there, to be able to communicate. You know, that's why we socialize, that's why we have meetings. So I look another woman in the eye, you know, and I'm doing a 5th step with her. That's what makes it work, you know, that's what makes her open up, that's what makes her do the things that this sentence says. You know, she knows, she looks at me and she doesn't want to trust me. And I say, listen, you know, I know what you're talking about. You know, I did these things too, you know, and more. And I don't tell her my whole story, you know, I just give a little bit at a time until I can see that look in her eye, that she knows and that she trusts me and that she's willing to share. And it's like a wonderful experience to be able to share this with another woman and have her open up to me and continue, and for her to work that sentence. You know, that's what makes us work. That's Alcoholics Anonymous, is to be able to relate to each other, aside from the sentence that you just read. I think that's what separates us from people who are not alcoholics and do not have this program.
Good, thank you, Sue. Yeah, this sentence really defines first century Christianity. And that was what the Oxford groups considered that they were practicing, a very, very simple form of the Christian message. And there are many people, as Sue says, who live by those Christian principles. There is something else, however, which we must always remember, and that is that the 12 steps are the vehicle which we use to practice these principles. By working the steps, we put these principles into our lives. They become a part of us. Certainly, our major purpose is to carry this message to others. And that's what we do, and we can do it when nobody else can, because the alcoholic is going to believe us when they would not believe somebody who had not been there before them. The Oxford groups had been the inspiration in many ways to many of the people who wrote the Big Book. Some of them were practicing Oxfordians even after the Big Book was written. Many of them had fallen away from the Oxfords, and there were several reasons for that. The Oxford rules for living, the steps which they espoused, were supposed to lead a person to a place of supposed perfection. And what our guys found out was that they didn't get perfect. That these 6 steps might bring others to perfection, but did not do that for them. In fact, when we read chapter 5 every day, at every meeting, notice that it talks about progress, not perfection. That's the reason that they put that phrase in there. And so they realized that there had to be more, that the steps of the six steps of the Oxford group were incomplete, basically because they did not contemplate what must be done from here on. Let's assume we worked the 6 steps and we're carrying the message as the 6 steps required us. Well, we still kept getting sick. We had, our defects kept coming back up. Untreated alcoholism began to raise its head. We hadn't found a way to stay spiritually fit. So they realized that there would have to be more. And through trial and error, the 10th step and the 11th step inventory evolved out of that knowledge. And what happened there was they took the steps which had come before and put them all together in one step to be used every day. An inventory, admission, submission to God, making amends, and carrying the message to others. Put all these into one step and said, okay, here's what we have to do. If we wish to continue to grow spiritually, to stay close to God, we're going to have to be willing to look at ourselves every day. And if we find something that's cropped up, we've got to take care of it right away. We can't allow these things to grow and fester, because what they had found was that these defects of character and this guilt that would come about because of something they had done to harm others, that these things blocked them from God. They could no longer partake of God's grace, and His Spirit would no longer be with them because they were blocking themselves off. So they had to find a way to stay spiritually fit, and they had to find a way to stay free of the things which blocked them. And the 10th step was a step of inspired genius, which performs precisely that function. And so the 6 steps of the Oxfords stopped at the point of having worked the steps with the idea that now, having done all this work, you are now perfect. And that is not the way it worked out for our guys. So many of them had fallen away from the Oxfordians. Yes?
Rose from a grateful alcoholic. I think sitting here and hearing this, now I'm understanding, for years, and you've talked about this too, you hear people say, I'm still sick after 20 years of sobriety, and they don't say recovered to me. If I'm recovered, then I'm going to think I'm well, and I can go out and drink again, and all this stuff. And as you're sharing all this, I'm seeing now, because of that sentence, progress, not perfection, everybody thinks by saying, if I'm not recovered or I'm still sick, that I'm still in the progress mode, and then I'll stick around or something. But and I guess maybe it's just a matter of semantics. But the Big Book talks about recovered alcoholics.
Oh, sure.
A lot of people, myself included, I'm like, I don't want to sit here in 20 years of sobriety and go, I'm still a sick person.
Well, I guess that really depends on what they mean by they're still sick. If they mean they have not become perfect yet, and that they are not being considered for canonization yet, then I suppose they could call themselves still sick. But the truth of it is that within a very short time, we all, if we work the steps, have a spiritual awakening. We enter the world of the Spirit. We're restored to sanity. We become God conscious. The Big Book says when the spiritual malady is overcome, and it will be, that we straighten out mentally and physically. The obsession, compulsion to drink has been taken from us. It doesn't exist. It is gone. And we have lost the insanity that we carried in here with us. The only thing we have not lost is alcoholism as a potential destroyer of us and our minds and our spirit, provided we drink again. The question, therefore, is answered by the Big Book. We will drink again if we rest on our laurels. If we do not stay spiritually fit, we will drink again. But we have recovered in the same sense that a cancer patient has reached a place of full remission. The symptoms are gone. Now, the fact that there is an incipient possibility of the return of cancer does not mean that there hasn't been recovery. Because remission, in the sense that the Big Book talks about, is recovery. It also says we are not cured of alcoholism, But what it is telling us is that it's in full remission, and that it's going to stay that way so long as we stay spiritually fit. And that's been proven by millions of people who have recovered doing just what we're talking about today. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, I was just sharing that as you were talking about this, I was kind of coming to light where some of the confusion might come. So you would say then that a recovered person is someone who's spiritually, who has a consciousness with God, and if you were to give I guess my question to you is, if you were to give a definition of recovered, what would you say is recovered alcoholic?
A recovered alcoholic, in terms of the disease of alcoholism, is described on page 85. Let's take a look at it. Well, let's look at this first, and then your 2 cents worth will come flying in. Page 85, let's go down to the bottom of page 84. And we have ceased fighting anything or anyone, even alcohol, for by this time sanity will have returned. We will seldom be interested in liquor. If tempted, we recoil from it as from a hot flame. We react sanely and normally. Now, what more do you want to know has happened that you've become normal? And we'll find this has happened automatically. We will see that our new attitude toward liquor has been given us without any thought or effort on our part. It just comes. That's the miracle of it. We're not fighting it, neither are we avoiding temptation. We can go into the barber shop now and not get a haircut. We can go any place and do anything we want to do, so long as we do so with the right motivation. We feel as though we've been placed in position of neutrality, safe and protected. This is from people, now this is for people who came in the door unable to stop drinking on their own, dying from the ravages of alcohol and this disease, in a state of mental and physical collapse, spiritual bankruptcy, and insanity. What has happened here? We feel as though we've been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We've not even sworn off. Never once in this big book does it say, don't drink. You know that? Not once. Why would you tell somebody who can't not drink, oh, just don't drink? They're coming to us saying, I can't stop drinking. Why are you telling me don't drink? Is that your solution? I sure don't need you. It never tells you don't drink. It tells us here, we haven't sworn off. That's not the solution. Most of us swore off over and over and over again. So what? It never stopped us. We picked up again. Instead, what? Now listen to this. The problem has been removed. It does not exist for us. This is how we react so long as we keep in fit spiritual condition. See how that works? That's recovery. We no longer have alcohol as any part or parcel of our lives. It's gone. The problem's been removed. Now we're talking about recovery from the disease of alcoholism. There are many other parts of our lives which are involved in this recovery as well. But we're not walking around now with untreated alcoholism, which is what you find with so many people who refuse to work the steps. They're miserable. They're terribly miserable. You wouldn't want to be in their shoes. They stay dry somehow, but they're miserable. Now those people can legitimately say, oh, I'm still sick. Yeah, they are. And if they get up here and say that, I leave, and I'll tell you why. I know how to be sick. If you're going to tell me your story, tell me how you recovered. I want to hear about recovery in here. I want to hear about the solution. I know how to be sick. I did that all on my own. Got it? We had another comment here.
Hey, Dennis. Well, back in Arizona, your friend, Lindsay, he used to say that we're either moving closer to a drink or further away from a drink. We're constantly going, if we do the things AA tells us, We help others, we go to step meetings, we take people through the steps, we're getting further away. As soon as we stop doing those things that AA has taught us, we're moving back towards the drift.
Of course.
I just wanted
There's no doubt about that.
I just wanted to throw that in because people said, "Are we recovered? We're recovering." I think it's every day is a new beginning. I look at every day as the beginning, and not that I have all these years, that today is a new day, and that anything can happen.
Right. But we've got to be careful, guys, because we can get ourselves all twisted up in semantics here. The real question is, what are you doing? If you are consistent and disciplined in doing the work, carrying the message, practicing these principles in all of your affairs, prayer, meditation, taking inventory, working with others, getting to meetings, you're going to stay sober. And you're going to stay in the vernacular recovered. If you want to call it, I'm recovering, or I'm in recovery, that's fine. No, who cares? The question is, what are you doing about it? Because it's only through the action that we receive the results. And the results we're looking for are on page 85, aren't they? And then we look at the 12th step. Isn't that what we want? To have that spiritual awakening? To be empowered and given the opportunity to carry this message to others? To have a thorough knowledge of the steps and how they work, and to be able to practice these principles in everything we do. Isn't that what we're looking for? And we get to have that by the time we get to 12th step. It's not going to be taken away from us so long as we continue to stay spiritually fit. What's the 11th step say? We seek through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. What does that connote other than continued spiritual growth and remaining spiritually fit? You see, we had another hand over here first. Yeah.
How you doing? My name's Tom McCoy. Last week, when I was going through something, driving on my way home, and I called up another alcoholic. I dwelled in that situation for a little bit, but then, I said to myself, I gotta turn it over. I gotta, I looked at my phone book, was right there, and I called a person in the phone book, and within moments, a couple of minutes, I felt better. A lot of times, like if I'm going through something on one side of me to say, Tyrone, you're not working the program or something like that, you might as well go out. But then again, I'm getting more clearer on that point of dealing with that person telling me that things are not going right for you. I get to the other side because the grass is a whole lot greener. When I called that person last week, it was just, it was by the grace of my higher power that I was able to pick up that cellular phone and call you up.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, and call that person up. And and that person who hit me is going to compensate me a little something.
Good. So that worked out okay, didn't it?
Yeah.
Marion, thanks a lot. Marion, you had your hand up?
Marion, I'm an alcoholic. My experience has been, and I've been around the program a while, I believe that I have recovered from my disease, but I have to remain teachable.
Sure.
If I allow this big ego of mine get in the way, I ease God right out, of the picture. My will comes in. But if I'm practicing God's will, and I had to really come to understand this. I had to come to understand what kind of a disease I had. I always, I like to say, we have such a sneaky disease,
Mm-hmm.
People, you hear all kinds of slogans around the room over the years, while we're sleeping, it's outside doing push-ups and this and that and all this other stuff. And my disease is not cured. It's just arrested for this 24-hour period. But if I do God's will, which is helping other drunk, take care of myself, use the brain that God gave me, and pray, I'm going to have a fairly good day, and I'm not going to pick up a drink.
Sure.
It's really very simple to me. And I keep it simple, and I have been doing that for 28 years, and I feel that I am recovered from my disease. But I have other character defects that will get me insane. And my disease of alcoholism likes to sneak right in there and say, see, I told you it wouldn't work. I told you you should have a drink, because look, you got laid off from that job. Look, the wife left you, the husband left you, blah, 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 And it always wants it. My disease for me, I always said, is like a little termite. It wants to break down the foundation. And my foundation for me has always been 1, 3, 7, and 11. And I have to practice that on a daily basis. And if I remain teachable and true to that, and change that old attitude that I came in here with, which was the great I am, I got a shot at staying sober today. I didn't have to worry about this day. Thank you, God, for that. That's the best thing I ever learned in AA. I didn't have to do it for today. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, well, thank you, Marion. Yeah, my sponsors came to me after I was 17 days sober, and they said, you're not going to make it. I said, how come? They said, your ego's too big. I said, what are you guys fooling with me for? I said, we need to practice. The first full paragraph, the middle of the page on page 16. Prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic, but he had succeeded only in keeping himself sober. Well, that only is kind of like with tongue in cheek. That was a major miracle for this guy who couldn't stay sober 10 days on his own. The broker had gone to Akron on a business venture which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. He suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician. Now then, this only tells a tiny part of what actually happened. I'm sure you all remember it, but let's remind ourselves. Bill went to Akron on business, and it was a disaster. And he was broke. He was in terrible shape financially. He'd been taking, for 6 months, he'd been trying to get anybody sober, and nobody would. They would come to his house, and they would eat his food, and they'd take his money. A couple of them set fires in his house, but nobody got sober. And Bill did not understand what was going on. He thought that if he could just get them to stop long enough so that he could show them how to recover, that they would be fine. But somehow or another, they weren't paying that much attention to him. And that's when he went to Dr. Silkworth and asked Dr. Silkworth what the problem was. And Silkworth said to him, Bill, you're going to have to get them to believe you. They're going to have to be willing to listen to you. So you're going to have to do something which will allow them to identify themselves with you. Which means you need to tell them your story. That is, tell them how you drank. Tell them what alcohol did to you. Tell them how you tried to stop and could not. By the way, that is all memorialized now and set out in great detail in Chapter 7. Just exactly what Dr. Silkworth told Bill to do. He said, also, Bill, I've learned something very important from you. When you were in my hospital the second time, and as you were leaving, if you may remember, I took you and Lois aside and I told you that you were a chronic alcoholic, that what you had was an incurable disease, that there was nothing more that we could do for you, and if you didn't stop drinking within a year, you would be dead. He said, I realize now that this was exactly what you needed to know, so that you were open to the possibility of stopping for good and all when your friend Ebby came to visit you. He said, this is what you need to do with these people. If they're allowing you to speak to them, try to make them understand what's the matter with them. Give them some idea of the nature of the disease they're carrying and its fatality and the fact that it is incurable. And he said, then it's also important for you to let them know that you have recovered and how you did it. Now, all of this advice that Dr. Silkworth gave to Bill on that day, we now find expanded, of course, but in great detail in chapter 7. This is exactly the way the Big Book now tells us to work with somebody who's new. So when we read this paragraph, we have to remember what in fact happened. Bill had gone there to Akron. He had no prior knowledge of anything there except a few business associates. When he came back to the Mayflower Hotel, he was a whipped puppy. He'd been torpedoed in this business venture. And he was standing there in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, and he could hear the laughter and the fun that was going on in the bar, which is off to his right. And he wanted to go in there and chuck it all, say the heck with it. In front of him was a message board, or a directory, the directory of churches in the area. And one of the ministers on that directory was listed as being the minister for the Oxford group. Well, Bill already had contact with the Oxfordians in New York. That's what Ebby had been taking him to. He'd been going to Oxford meetings. So instead of going in and getting a drink, he called up the minister. And he told the minister, who happened to be there, thank you God, that what he was in town for, and that he needed to talk to somebody who was an alcoholic who was having difficulty recovering. The minister knew of Dr. Bob because Bob had tried out the Oxfordians at one time. And when he was there, he had met a woman named Henrietta Sieberling. And Henrietta was the heiress of the Sieberling tire fortune. And so the minister gave Bill Henrietta's phone number and said, give her a call. I believe she knows just the right person for you. So Bill called Henrietta, and she was there, thank you God. And she decided that he was legit, so she decided to put him in touch with Dr. Bob. And this is what happened. When Bill got together with Dr. Bob, he followed the suggestions, the directions that Dr. Silkworth had given him. He told Bob first about how he drank and how alcohol affected him and how he tried to stop but could not. And then he told Dr. Bob about the disease, and Dr. Bob was a medical guy, but he never heard anything like this. It was not in any of the literature. But Bill was so credible by this time, and he was quoting Dr. Silkworth, and Dr. Bob had to believe him that he was suffering from a disease that could be called alcoholism. And then Bill told him what he had done to recover. And Dr. Bob was fascinated by that. And he had no problem with it because Dr. Bob had probably done a whole lot more in the way of spiritual study and involvement than Bill ever thought of doing. But it never worked for him. And now Bill was saying, here's a spiritual program which involves the working of certain steps. And when we work these steps, something happens. And we recover. And so Dr. Bob was willing to try that, and he did. And of course, as they say, that's where it all started. The rest is history. Had that not happened, think about it for a second, it's very unlikely any of us to be here. There wouldn't be any fellowship. On that slender thread hung the whole fate of millions of people, millions of alcoholics. Dr. Bob got drunk again, but he finally ended up sober, and he went out and made amends one day. He drove around town in his old Model A Ford, made amends, best he could. And then another miracle happened. Well, let's see if we can read about it here. Let's go down on page 17. The physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady, with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. Something happened, you see. There is some kind of magic or miracle that happens when we sit down with a suffering alcoholic and explain to them what the problem is. Tell them about their disease. He sobered, never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. This seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. Now, Dr. Bob said on several occasions, when Bill came to him and told him and talked to him, he said he was the first human being who ever talked to me about this and knew what he was talking about. Why? Because Bill had been there. He wasn't moralizing. He wasn't preaching. He wasn't trying to fancy dance around Dr. Bob with a bunch of what Dr. Silkworth calls frothy emotional appeal. Look what you're doing to your wife. Don't you think that you ought to be able to stop? You're a smart guy and all this stuff. None of that ever worked for Bob. But this man, Bill, knew what he was talking about. He goes on to say on 17 XVII, it also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. Now, that sentence, burn that into our minds, because in Bill's story, we're going to read it again, and he's going to put a little different context. This is what he's going to say. That if an alcoholic failed to enlarge and perfect his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain low spots ahead, and he would drink again. It's a real clear message, isn't it? And right here, in the meeting between Bob and Bill, he says it also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. This requirement of work and self-sacrifice for other people never ceases. It is always with us. The big book in chapter 7 says, nothing will so much ensure immunity from the next drink as strenuous work with other alcoholics. It works when other methods fail. And that's the truth. Now then, let's see what this miracle was, this second miracle. Here's the two men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving in the ward of Akron City Hospital. Their very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became AA number 3. He never had another drink. My goodness, in 3 little sentences, talking about a major miracle that happened with Bill Dodson, AA number 3, a story's in the back of the book. Bill Dodson was a lawyer, and Bill was a real bad drunk. He was a good guy when he wasn't drinking. He was married, but he got drunk, and he would get drunk, he'd get violent. When they came to the hospital, the Akron hospital, looking for somebody they could talk to, the nurses said, well, we got a doozy over here for you. They had this guy strapped down because he'd already beat up on 2 nurses. And he was one nasty son of a gun when he was drinking and when he was detoxing. So they strapped him down. Now here was a guy who everybody gave up on. The hospital wasn't going to try to get him sober. They just wanted to avoid getting hurt by him. As soon as he got detoxed, they were going to kick him out. Well, Bill and Bob came in there, and they sat down next to Bill D., and they began talking to him. You've all seen the picture of the man in the bed. The 2 men sitting beside the bed. That's Bill and Bob and Bill D. in the bed. The man in the bed. One of the most famous pictures in AA, and it's very, very important because, you see, here are 2 guys that had this theory. They thought this stuff would work. So far it had worked on Bob. Now would it work on somebody else? Now here was a guy who was a chronic, hopeless, helpless, violent alcoholic. They sat down on that first day and they talked to him. And the second day they came back and talked some more, and they told him about recovery. They told him about the spiritual life that they could lead and that he could lead too, and that this would lead to his recovery. That night he talked to his wife, and something happened. In effect, he said, I believe these guys have something here. I believe I ought to embrace it. And when they came back the next day, he said, I'm ready. Something happened. We can all say, why are we surprised now? Because we know so much about how God works in people's lives. But these, Bill and Bob, were astonished. But nevertheless, Bill D. was out of the hospital 2 days later, never to return. Never to return. And just a second. And Dr. Silkworth saw this happening time after time after time in his hospital. He watched these guys come in and do exactly the same thing with his hopeless, helpless cases that he'd stuck off in a corner. And he'd watch these guys come in and talk to his chronics. And in a few days they would get up and walk out sober. And 6 months later, or 2 months later, even 30 days later, they'd be back carrying the message to the next chronic, not having had a drink in the meantime. Silkworth saw this happening over and over and over again. This miracle was happening. Right here is where it started. Right here with Bill Dodson. And that's a chronicle in itself. And Bill's story is in the back of the book. It's well worth reading. Yes, sir?
Where was Evie during all this? Had he started drinking? Evie actually helped Bill.
Yeah, well, Ebby had problems staying sober, as most people know. Bill thought of him as his sponsor. And I don't know where Ebby was at the time that Bill was in Akron. I believe, however, that he was still sober and living in New York. And he was, remember, the Oxfords were in New York. And that's where Ebby had gotten sober. And that's also the place where his sponsor was. And Roland Hazard, who had gotten him, see, Roland went and got him away from the judge. Remember, they're going to lock Ebby up forever? And the judge put Ebby into Roland's parole. And Roland took him to meetings of the Oxfordians, and Ebby got sober. So I'm pretty sure he was still there and still sober at that time. It was later. He got drunk several times. There's a very interesting tape, which I have a copy of, which was the funeral oration that Bill gave when Ebby died, and he told Ebby's story there, and it was a very moving piece. If you're interested, I'll try to get your copy. Okay. All right. Now then, here's another miracle that happened, and this, let's say again, thank you, God. It took all of these things before AA began to even have the glimmer of a possibility of existing as we know it today. Over and over again we see these things happening that had never happened before. And they had to happen in a certain sequence. They had to happen just as they did happen. So if you're like me, you see God's hand in this. He was guiding this all along. And then from Ebby to Bill, from Bill to Bob, from Bob and Bill to Bill D, and then and from there on, it began to take off. He goes on to say on page 17, XVII, this work at Akron continued through the summer of 1935. And remember that Bill Wilson was living with the Smiths now at their house. And they were kind of caretaking him because he didn't have any money. And Lois was back in New York working at Macy's or someplace. She was able to support herself. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. When the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time. Just think about how crude this was at that time. Here were a bunch of drunks kind of sitting around trying to help each other. Did they say, oh, we're the first AA group? They didn't know that. They didn't know very much of what in the heck they were doing. All they knew was that by working together and supporting each other and carrying a message to each other, somehow or another they were staying sober. And every once in a while somebody else would show up and they would carry the message to them. A second small group promptly took place in New York, to be followed in 1937 by the start of a third at Cleveland. Besides these, there were scattered alcoholics who had picked up the basic ideas in Akron or New York, who were trying to form groups in other cities. By late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic. By this time they were saying, holy cow, guys, it looks like we really have something here. Whew, this stuff works. It really works. There are people staying sober here now for a year and a half, who couldn't stay sober 10 minutes before. You remember, most of these people were real low bottom. Of course, low bottom drunk was defined for me when I first came in as just a drunk with short legs. Because I used to call myself a high bottom drunk, and they said, well, a high bottom drunk is a drunk with long legs. So sit down, dummy, and keep your mouth shut. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. Wasn't real nice. They never heard of tough love. No, they never. I'm sure they didn't know that term. But you remember, Marion? They did not take it soft and easy on us, did they? They made sure we understood how the cow ate the cabbage. And that worked, too. Okay. So they decided, okay, now it was now time the struggling groups thought to place their message and unique experience before the world. Notice that their purpose right in the beginning was to place their message and their unique experience before the world. Never once did they have it in mind to publish a book or to disseminate writings which would be filled with beautiful philosophies and yugatas and all that stuff. They wanted to simply spread the word. In other words, if you look at chapter 7 and you see how we have to work in person with a newcomer, then you see how the big book is formed. The big book is built along the same lines as how we go to a newcomer when we have them face to face. It tells us about alcoholism. It tells us how these folks tried to recover, how they couldn't. It tells us that there is hope, that there is a solution, and then it gives us the solution. And page after page after page, it says, this is what we did. And it worked for us. And we believe it will work for you. And Dr. Bob believed it so much he made us a direct promise that it never fails. He said, if you go about it with one half the zeal you used to go about getting your next drink. He was right, too. That's why if I've got somebody new in front of me, I'll look them in the eye and tell them flat out, you follow the direction of this book, you do what I tell you to do it with a good heart, I promise you're going to be just fine. I promise you. Because I know it's the truth. I don't have to pussyfoot around or beat around the bush or use a bunch of weasel words to try to protect myself from committing myself. I don't have to say, oh, my sponsor told me that you would recover. Or you told me. Who's you? That's all of you out there. I can use you as an authority because nobody can ever prove you didn't. And my sponsor's been dead a long time. You can't check with either one of those guys to figure out if they ever actually told me that. But this saves me a lot of grief because I don't have to express anything as my own opinion or my own experience. I can always say my sponsor told me. I hate it when I hear that. I always want to say, well, who's your sponsor? Let's get your sponsor up here. Let's find out what he or she has to say. Anyway. I hope you'll forgive me. I editorialize a lot. Okay. So, it goes on page 17. This determination, that is, to write the book, bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The membership then reached about 100 men and women. The fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. The blind period ended, and AA entered a new phase of its pioneering time. Keep in mind that this is not the whole story either, because these guys were all power drivers, they were all entrepreneur types, they had major egos, and they thought that what they had here was so hot that it was going to make them a fortune. So they put together a separate corporation, and they issued stock, and people bought stock in this corporation, which was going to publish this book, sell millions of copies, and make all of them rich. Not exactly eleemosynary, was it? Not a charitable thought in the bunch. The idea was that they could save all of these souls out there, and at the same time, why not? They could make a fortune doing it. It turned out, of course, as we all know, that did not work, and eventually the book was transferred over to the trustees of the Alcoholism Foundation, and the private corporation was dissolved. It was interesting, though, that in the initial printing of 4,000 copies, the first edition, first printing, they were all in a warehouse and nobody had bought them. You couldn't even get them out in the bookstores. But there were 77 copies that had been brought out of that warehouse and distributed to the stockholders. They each got one, or maybe two. And to those few people who had purchased the first draft of the big book that Bill had reproduced on multi-lith, and he sold it for $3.50. You remember Marty Mann, the first woman in AA? Yeah. Marty bought one of those original manuscripts, and with the promise that for $3.50 she would get the manuscript, and when the book was finally published in hardcover, she would be entitled to receive a book. So Marty got her book, which she'd already paid for when she bought the multi-lith manuscript. And by the way, if you haven't seen that manuscript, it's fascinating. It truly is, because Bill was so far off base when he wrote that. He didn't follow the formula of this is what we did. His formula was, this is what you got to do. Now you do this, now you do that. And when he got to the three pertinent ideas, right after the three pertinent ideas in the 5th chapter, he said, if you read the book at this point and you're not convinced, reread it to this point, and if you're still not convinced, throw it away. So the editorial board got hold of it, and they said, no, Bill. What did they change it to? 2 words. Being convinced. Then, comma, we were at step 3. They took out all that stuff. And all of the language which said you instead of that you must do was changed to we did. There are quite a few musts. Somebody counted them. I think they're about right. Probably about 62 musts. No, people, there are no musts in the big book. That's a bunch of baloney. And every one of the musts in the big book means or else, just as it says on page 72, in connection with doing the 5th step. You got to do it or else. We must or else. So, yes?
I was just going to ask about, you had mentioned before that there were time restrictions in the big book on the steps.
Sure.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that or point it out.
Sure, absolutely. That's a good question. On page 64, the top of the page, the time restriction is at once. This is following the 3rd step and before we start the 4th step. What it says is, though the step was vital and crucial, could have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous effort to find and be rid of the things in ourselves which have been blocking us from God. Now then, if you go to the bottom of page 75, you will find that the time limit there is 1 hour. 1 hour between the 5th and the 6th steps. and there is no time lapse between 6 and 7. The time limit there is when ready. Immediately, when ready. Now, if you want to see a time limit for working the steps, you go to page 58. We read it at every meeting, or most meetings. It says this: if you have decided you want what we have, and are willing to go to any length to get it, what's the next word? Then you are ready to take certain steps. Then means right now. Does not mean somewhere a year from now when your lazy sponsor gets around to it. Yes.
I think, the whole big book and pointing all this out is just so amazing, but, and that takes you back to that sentence that you read where, because I know I was like, with the spiritual and the religion and just trying to find out, seek some help. And it wasn't working. It's like, what's wrong? It was still in the confusion. It says this physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silksworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. And I think that's so key, because you see so many people that have tried this and they tried that, and it's like they feel so bad, like I'm just this horrible, bad person. And they don't know or understand or comprehend that they're a sick person. And that's so key in reading that, where it just makes it real clear that you're a sick person. You're not a bad person. And once you understand that, then it's like a big weight's been lifted from you, and you can muster up that willingness to pursue it. And anyway, that's all I wanted to share.
Okay, good. Thank you. Oh, one other time limit I forgot about. Page 84, the paragraph that deals with the 10th step. It says, we commence this way of living, and the word there is as. We cleaned up the past, which means simply that as we're doing our 9th step, we also begin working our 10th step.
Jim?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Page 75. After the 5th step, last paragraph. Returning home, we find a place where we can be quiet for
1 hour. Right.
And then, after the 7th step, after we have completed, when ready, we say something like this, and it doesn't say recite the 7th step prayer, it just says say something like this. After you say your 7th step prayer, then it says, now we need to take more action.
Sure.
2 more.
What don't we understand about the word now? You see, the truth of it is that New Age AA and the modern version of the steps would have us believe that it doesn't matter how you work them so long as you do, that you don't want to try to get sober by next Thursday and all of this stuff. But this ignores what the big book tells us. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this together, because there's material in here that just simply doesn't get out. I mean, there's a lot of people in here have read this stuff maybe many, many times. I know Marion's probably read it 200, 400 times. But as we study it together, we see new connections all the time. She was talking about something that's real for her and real for me. We keep learning all the time. Every time I go through this book, especially if I'm going through it with a group, I see connections I never saw before. Because this book is so dense that you could actually take all of this that we're going to be studying and make 10 or 12 volumes out of it, and you still wouldn't cover it all. So that's why we have to study it word for word and phrase by phrase. I hope you see what I'm talking about now, and how we're going to cover this book together in such a way that we keep broadening our understanding of what's going on here and how it all ties together and how it works. And I hope that you will stick with us on this, because I know you're going to find it a wonderful experience to really see how an inspired piece of writing is put together and how it all ties together. And you're going to find not one single inconsistency in this book. And I've been talking to people for 37 years, telling them please show me, if you can, any lie in the big book. And nobody's ever been able to do it.
Chapter to wives.
Except chapter to the wise. Tell us about it, Sue.
Chapter to wives is a lie. It's a lie in the big book. Chapter to wives insinuates that it was written by a woman because it was chapter to wives. It's a lie. It's Bill Wilson and drag.
That's right. It not only insinuates, it says, we wives.
It says we wives, and it's not. It's Bill. Bill
Are you
wrote
sure
it.
it wasn't Lois?
She was asked to write it.
Sounds an awful lot like Al-Anon.
He's just
not.
speaking for the wives.
No, it says we wives. Okay, I don't know where the time goes with this bunch. You guys are terrific now. There's one essential ingredient for long-term sobriety that Marion forgot to mention. Don't die. I'm working on it. All right, let's go now to forward to the third edition. We'll find that on page Roman 22, XXII. By March 1976, when this edition went to the printer, the total worldwide membership of Alcoholics Anonymous was conservatively estimated at more than 1 million, with almost 28,000 groups meeting in over 90 countries. Well, my goodness. Today, the membership is conservatively estimated at more than 5 million, with over 100,000 groups in over 140 countries. So we're still in a exponential explosion. And why? Well, you know, the reason's got to be pretty simple. This stuff works. You know, if these 12 steps didn't work, there'd be no AA. We wouldn't be here. It would have died out long ago. People ask you, how do I know? How do you know this stuff's going to work? Well, it worked for me, but it's worked for millions of others. And it continues to work. And we have no doubt that it'll work for you too, but you're going to have to get in there and do your part. Surveys of groups in the United States and Canada indicate that AA is reaching out not only to more and more people, but to a wider and wider range. Women now make up more than 1/4 of the membership among newer members. The proportion is nearly 1/3. Oh, and among newer members, the proportion is nearly 1/3. 7% of AAs surveyed are less than 30 years of age. Among them, many in their teens. And I'm sure that percentage has gone way up as well. The basic principles of the AA program, it appears, hold good for individuals with many different lifestyles, just as the program has brought recovery to those of many different nationalities. The 12 steps that summarize the program may be called Los 12 Pasos in one country or Les 12 Etapes in another, but they trace exactly the same path to recovery that was blazed by the earliest members of Alcoholics Anonymous. Listen to that now. They trace exactly the same path to recovery that was blazed by the earliest members of Alcoholics Anonymous. How often we forget that. We always want to take something that works just fine and screw around with it. We're not satisfied to look back and say this has worked for millions. Oh, but I think I can do it better. Or Dr. So-and-so has got this new form and it'll work a lot better. And so on and so on. And these books that are published. And there are a whole bunch of them out there. The problem there is that so many people believe they understand the 12 steps who do not. Because, you know, to really understand them, you have to work them, don't you? You guys are going to have to excuse me for just a moment, because I have an emergency. When you get to be
Who did bring the cake?
Ronald.
Ronald.
Thanks, Ronald.
Thank you, Ronald, for the cake. Hi, I'm Sarah, your secretary, and I'm an alcoholic. Hi, Sarah. We do have a celebrant here, Marianne, who has 28 years. We don't have your medallion because I understand you're getting it at your home group, but we did want to recognize you, and the cake's for you. Thank you very much.
Marion, come on up here and say a couple words.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
How'd you
Thanks.
do it? How'd you do it,
How do
Mary?
I do it? One day at a time, and I didn't drink. That's how you do it. And you get into that book. And my name is Marion. I'm a very grateful alcoholic. And they tell me when I got sober, jump in the water, it's fine. And I jumped in the middle of AA, and I've been there ever since. I haven't fallen off the edges, you know. And you stay in the middle. And you don't drink, and you get into the steps, and the miracle happens. And that's as simple as it is, you know. I have a sponsor. I still have a sponsor. I work with others. That has saved my ass in plain English. It tells me it ain't any better out there all the time. And it's you know, my disease is still out to get me, you know. But if I stay spiritually fit, it don't get in here. You know, it's not in the bottle; it's in here. You know, and it took some time for that to sink in and understand that. You know, and I had to give time. You know, it was a word I hated when I came in here. You know, but it was things I must experience, and it was things. Today, it's the things I must enjoy, and that's what I do. Today, I enjoy life one day at a time. Grateful to Alcoholics Anonymous for being here. Without it, I would have never been able to raise 4 children and have a home and do all the things. I would have never become the daughter that my mother always wanted. She saw me 14 years sober before she died. You know, there are lots of wonderful gifts from being sober. But most of all, I got me. I didn't know who I was before I got here. And that's what I found out through the process of the steps. A lot of hard work. And the most important thing, I think, is to continue to work, to persevere. And that's it. You know, and some days I want to put the cover over my head, no, that's enough, you know? But thank you for God, because I learned how to pray, and I learned how to trust Him. And I learned how to trust a sponsor, and I learned how to participate in life again because of Alcoholics Anonymous. Sober, you know. And I participated before, but I wasn't there half the time. You know, I was in la-la land, fantasy. You know, I came in here believing my own lies. I don't know if anybody identifies with that. You know, oh yeah, that's a truth. Well, it was a lie. I said it so much I believed it. You know, so if you don't pick up the first drink, they said you can't get drunk, and that's what I did. You know, I followed the suggestions. There's no rules in AA, but they told me there's a lot of musts, and they're in that big book, and that's what I found out. You know, and somewhere, God's grace got in me and said, okay, be willing to try it, you know. And my ego, that sick ego I had when I got here, told me I could do anything. So, what do you mean? You know, well, yeah, I could do that, you know. I mean, I bluffed my way through life for years. And I found that all of that wasn't negative if I learned to use it in a positive way. And that, you know, it talks about it in the promises. You know, they will become our assets, and they have. You know, that God chose me to help some other woman. You know, that's a miracle. Who, me? I go, who, me? You know, sometimes, you know, somebody say, oh, I heard you speak the other night, and oh, you said that wonderful thing, and I go, what did I say? You know, and I don't know what I say. You know, God speaks through me today. You know, and He speaks through all of us. You know, you know, I just have to let Him, you know, and how I let Him is I don't pick up the first drink, and that's how it works. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary.
I have medical sponsees
Yeah.
I've never done this before. I'm starting my fourth step. How would you, I mean, when I did the fourth step, I wrote, my sponsor had to answer like 60, 70 questions. Then I had the sheets put out about the resentments, the fears, and whatever. And I just need to get some advice, maybe where to go, because I just, you know, I'm enjoying it. I'm loving this group. I mean, I can't tell you what it does for me.
Let me see. Sue, do you have any more of those?
I have your
You have the 4-step guide?
No, I have Sid Smith gave me your 12 steps. You know, Sid?
Yeah, well, the 4-step is in there. Do you have any more of the 4-step guides when you edited?
I don't have any of my cards. I'll be here next week.
Yeah, but I'm starting it Wednesday. Maybe you can fax it to me, or
Write down your fax number.
yeah, let me
Write down your phone number. I can call you before I fax.
Yeah, I'll give you my card.
We have a celebrant. This is not her home group, and we don't have a medallion because she's getting it at her home group, but it's Marion, and she's got 28 years.
Oh, yeah, well, we'll recognize her
And we have a cake.
Okay.
We do?
Yeah, someone brought a cake.
Oh, good. Do you have any announcements? As a secretary?
No.
Okay.
Well, you know, it's normal.
Well, you recognize Marion, then I'll call on you as soon as we reconvene.
Any like suggestions or? Just,
Well,
I mean, do I have to? I'm a little nervous. I know. I mean, I know it's what's going to happen. It's supposed to happen. You know.
yeah, well, you need to put the wheels in motion.
Right. Exactly.
It's a good idea to know what you're doing.
Well, I will get prepared.
Well, if you do exactly what it tells you to do in here,
Should I have them me answering all these questions, like these 60?
of course not.
No, that's what my sponsor said. Yeah, exactly.
There's the resentment list.
Right.
You got 5 questions here. You got about 8 questions here. And those questions all go to the very specific issues involved
Okay.
in finding out what our defects are. Remember, we're looking for resentment, dishonesty, selfishness, and fear. That's what we're looking for. And the way the big book, yeah, keep it right on that. When your people do their fears list, have them write down all their fears, and then you're going to ask God to take the fears away. Now, all this stuff is in that 12-step guide that you have.
Right. Now she said, my sponsor, I know that she said that when you do the questions, and she's had many, many years in the program too, she said you're kind of like jolting your memory.
Doing what?
You're jolting your memory.
Oh yeah, there's a process of association that works. And a lot of times you'll write down some stuff and then a little later some more will come up, you just fill in the gaps. But it's all a written inventory. And you don't fill in any blank forms, you just write it out. Because here's what we ask. We resolutely look for our own mistakes. Where had we been selfish? That requires a narrative answer. Not was I selfish, but where was I selfish? Because we're looking for actions, motivations, and attitudes that caused our failure. But all you have to do is get them to answer the questions as they are in the big
How
book.
long do you think like a 4th step should take? I've heard people spend, I spent 6 weeks, or I don't know. One girl told me she spent a year. How long when you do you spend on the 4th step?
30 days, 2 weeks, 30 days, 6 weeks, 6 weeks maximum. And if it's taking longer than that, then they're just dogging it. One thing you can do that'll help, though, if you're having this meeting, have them bring all their stuff and have them sit down and spend an hour writing. Not just talking about it, but actually doing it. That's what I do. If I see somebody who's dragging their feet or doesn't know what, they're unsure about it, tell them meet with me and I'll sit with you while you write. It gets done that way.
No, I know that. I know that.
And then we'll tie it up and
Came in a little last night.
close it out. So
Oh, good. Thank you.
when my phone is out, nudges.
Did Sarah tell you that we're going to celebrate Marion? Because Marion has 20.
So now I have one.
Thank you.
I know you're a cake man.
Yes, I am.
Like terry socks, like thick, like steak. But see, if you make it too thick, then it'll make it rub more. They're both touching.
Actually, my son, Bill is my son.
Hi, Jeff. What's your name? Bill. Hey, Bill. I'm happy to see you, man.
Pleasure to meet you.
I think he's going to have 9 weeks Wednesday.
Good. Yeah. Good. How do you feel?
I feel good. Great.
Yeah, you're looking fine, man.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you cleaned up real well.
Oh, yeah? How can you tell?
I can just tell.
Oh, yeah?
How are you doing, babe?
Doing fine.
Good.
I feel a lot of relief that the kid isn't out there. I don't know what the hell he's doing.
The kid, huh?
Yeah, the kid.
You're the kid?
Yeah.
I have 3. He's my middle one.
I see. Well, it certainly makes you feel a lot better, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's easier to live without worry.
Well,
Drive up here from Miami?
do I?
Yeah.
No, I live in Broward now in Pompano.
Oh, that's not far then.
No. I drove up yesterday from the Keys, but
Oh,
I do some work down there too.
yeah.
So the meetings I go to are all over the place.
Oh, yeah, you travel around?
Well, I'm glad you came here. Very
Yeah, me too. I love this group. I look forward to it every week.
When you said about the women, I was thinking, wouldn't it be funny if we become the percentage that the women are bigger than the men in the group?
Oh, it can happen. It can happen.
It's harder for men to admit they need help.
I can talk to somebody.
Yes, there's in most cases there's a lot more pride, and it's not overcome by as much emotionalism.
It takes them longer. Took my
The problem with
31 years.
women tend to be a lot more whiny and dependent. And
I couldn't go to women's meetings for 5 years. I was ready to slap people.
I could never go to one of those.
Oh, some of them are bad. Some of them are good. There's